Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today, SQL Server and Oracle Database Licensing. Your presenters will be myself, Suman Chen, and doing the heavy lifting will be Ken Shaw. There is an opportunity to ask questions via the chat box that you'll see in your control, in the webinar control screen. And a couple of the guys will respond as best we can during the webinar. If not, we'll read the questions at the end of the webinar. And also at the end of the webinar, you'll have a chance to raise your hand, and we can actually unmute you so that you can ask questions live. There will be both a recorded version and an email. We can send via email a copy of the presentation if you like. Just shoot us an email. We'd be happy to do that. So I'm sure many of you have heard about the little bit of snow that we've received in Boston this past week. And you know, as you come up to an intersection, you see these huge mounds of snow, and you can't see beyond it. So, what our objective is today is somewhat analogous to licensing, getting the snow out of the way. We want to clear those roads and make something complex fairly simple. So that's our goal today. So the topics today, we're going to cover both SQL Server and Oracle. Apologies in advance if some of the slides we're going to go through fairly quickly. We've got a lot of examples and quite a lot of material to go over today, so we sort of have to pick and choose. So both in the SQL Server and Oracle databases, you'll see that we'll go over the additions first, then how the products are licensed, and then we'll cover compliance. So SQL, we're going to focus on 2012-2014 editions, and again, we'll primarily focus on the top three: the Enterprise, Business Intelligence, and Standard editions. The Web one is, as it says, web hosting, and then we also have Developer and Express editions for ISVs and developers. There are actual capacity limits to these different editions of SQL Server. The only one that doesn't have any capacity limits is the Enterprise per core version. The Enterprise Server Cal is, of course, the upgrade from the previous 2008 version. So that's not available for purchase today. And all the others have actual max CPU and max memory limitations. So there are pretty major differences in the SQL Server editions. We've just compared here some of the different availabilities, different features, if you will, that you can have under Enterprise versus the other editions, and of course better management with database snapshots, indexing, online indexing, and parallel, of course, greatly enhances performance. The always-on capabilities is the ability to fail over groups of databases, not just single databases, so for reliability. And then, of course, the encryption, the transparent database encryptions are definite features that last year I'm sure the Target and JP Morgan Chase CIOs which they had enabled. And then the security auditing and BI features. But it's expensive. As you can see here, it's approximately 4 times, Enterprise Edition is approximately 4 times the price of Standard Edition. So it's $6,800 per core. This is list with a 4-core minimum. That's about $27,000 versus a little under $7,000 for the Standard Edition. So Ken will now go into describing the SQL Server licensing features and compliance. Ken?
Thank you, Suman. Welcome, everybody. So the first thing to keep in mind about the licensing is that there are different editions and types. Suman has gone over those briefly. With the Enterprise, it's basically per core only, and the Business Intelligence is only per server. So where you have the flexibility or the challenge is with the standard. You can license that either per core or per server. And basically, you would make that decision based on cost and some other factors that Suman will mention. Some other very important things to always keep in mind to avoid being confused about the licensing. Licenses are assigned only to physical servers, not to virtual servers. Of course, you can run SQL Server on a virtual machine, and you have to have licenses to cover that, but you do not assign the licenses to the virtual machines, only to the physical servers. And then as far as how many licenses, what you get for getting a license, if it's a core license, that license will cover one core of whatever number of cores you count up that you need or are using. And then for the server, you need one license for each server. And in the case of the server plus CALs, it's more complicated because you also have to get the CALs, or client access licenses, for every user or device that's accessing the server. Okay, some more on the general rules. For some Microsoft products, if you install multiple instances in a given OSE, and OSE is an operating system environment, a physical one or a virtual one. If you install multiple instances, you have to license each one. But with SQL Server, you're always entitled to install an unlimited number of instances in a given OSE. So that should not complicate things. And then there are these minimums. You might have a system where SQL Server that you have installed is only using 1 or 2 cores, but you always have to count it as 4, with 1 or 2 exceptions that we'll cover. So always keep that in mind, that you might have to be purchasing more core licenses than you might think if you're not keeping that in mind. And then one other thing is hyperthreading. You know, that's the ability of a core to execute 2 threads, so it's a kind of a parallelism. Microsoft, if you're counting physical cores, and we'll get into the details of whether you would be counting physical or virtual cores, but if you're counting physical cores, you don't have to pay attention to the hyperthreads. You don't have to count them. But if you're counting virtual cores, then a hyperthread counts as a virtual core. So they might say, here's a CPU, and it's got 2 cores, and it's hyperthreaded. That would actually be 4 cores in the virtual world. Okay, we're now going to go into a breakdown of the rest of the rules by edition. Well, it's by edition and by version, but as Suman said, we're focusing just on the 2012 and 2014 versions. And by the way, this is one of the ways I think that you really need to think about things in order to keep things from getting complicated. Sometimes people try to say something general about standard that covers a whole bunch of versions, and it might be true, and then they have to throw in a bunch of caveats, and that gets confusing. So both the standard and the business intelligence, when licensed per server, follow exactly the same rules, so they're together here. So you license it by OSE, so you have to get one license for each OSE, and that could be a physical or a virtual or a bunch of virtuals. And basically you just count all the OSEs that you're using, and the number of OSEs that you're using, meaning you have SQL Server running in that OSE, gives you the number of licenses. And of course you have to get device CALs, or user and device CALs. So here's an example. This big blue rectangle represents a server, in this case a physical server, and it's got 16 cores in it. And what you need is one server license. So the fact that it has 16 cores is irrelevant for the per server licensing. And then of course you have to get the CALs in addition to the server license. And here's the other kind of common environment that you would be running SQL Server in, and that is on virtual machines, or VOSEs. So in this example, we have the same physical server we had before, and we've installed 2 virtual machines. And they're each configured identically, so each one has 8 cores out of the 16 that are total on the physical machine. But again, the cores don't matter. It's just you have 2 operating system environments here running SQL Server. Therefore, you have to have 2 standard licenses. Okay, now we'll go on to the next case. We're still with the standard edition, but now we're licensing per core instead of per server. So in this case, it's one license, entitles you to one core, and it's the same kind of license purchase, whether it's going to be for a physical or a virtual core in the way you count things. If you're running SQL Server in the physical environment, then you count the physical cores, and that's all the physical cores on the server. It doesn't matter how small you think your SQL Server is. You have to get as many licenses as physical cores. On the other hand, if you're running SQL Server in a virtual environment, then you count all the virtual cores. So it's kind of the same thing in that you have to count all the cores that are in the OSE, but it's not necessarily all the cores that are on the physical machine. And then for that physical server, which is the thing that you have to assign your licenses to, you have to add up the requirement for the POSE and all the requirements for the VOSEs together, and that gets you a total for that physical server. So just because you, let's say you're running in both the POSE and the VOSE, and you have gotten enough licenses for all the physical cores, that does not give you any rights in addition to run in virtuals. You have to count those separately. Okay, so we'll go through an example for that.
Ken, I think you slid.
Did I go too fast? Yeah, we want to. There we go, okay. Because we have two examples. We want to show where you're licensing just by the POSE and then the VOSE. So we've got that same server with the 4 CPUs and a total of 16 cores. So the result is you need to get 16 core licenses. And again, it doesn't matter how big or small your SQL server is. On the other hand, if instead of running in the POSE, you're running some VOSEs, in this case 2 of them, you do it differently. So in this case, you see that we don't show it here, but this is the same physical server with 16 cores, but the VOSEs are configured as shown. So the one on the left is only using 2 of the virtual cores, and the one on the right is using 8. So there are a whole bunch of cores that are unused. So the way you have to count this is the one on the left that has the 2 cores has to be counted as 4 because of that rule that you have to have a minimum of 4 cores assigned to an OSE. And then the one on the right has 8, so you get a total of 12 cores are being used, and therefore you're required to have 12 core licenses. So by doing it this way, you don't have to use the whole set of 16 cores. In this slide, we're just showing an example of how to count virtual cores. Sometimes people get confused by that, and these are all examples that result in 4 virtual cores with different numbers or kinds of CPUs. Okay, now we'll turn over to the Enterprise Edition, and this is the per server license, which is a legacy one. So it's not something you can buy from Microsoft today, but you could upgrade to it if you have software assurance. So in this case, the license is a little more complicated. One license allows you to run SQL Server in 4 OSEs, and those can be physical and or virtual. And you simply count all the OSEs that you're running SQL Server in, and then figure out how many licenses you need. So if you've got 3 OSEs, then 1 license would cover it. If you had more, you'd need more licenses. And of course, you have to get the user and device CALs. The thing about the core limits at the end of that slide, that doesn't affect the way you compute your licensing. That's a usage limitation that your DBA should pay attention to. Did I skip over an example? No, we didn't have one here. Okay, so now we'll turn to the Enterprise Edition license per core, which is probably the most challenging case because you have options as to how to do it. It can be a little confusing to figure out which option is better or when you can use which option. So the first thing is it's per core, so you buy core licenses, 1 license, 1 core, regardless of whether you're counting them by physical or virtual. So the complexity starts here that you can count the number of cores that you have to license in 2 ways. or potentially 2 ways depending upon your configuration. So if you're running SQL Server in the physical environment, then you don't have a choice. Then you have to license by the physical cores. On the other hand, if you're running SQL Server only in the virtual environments on that physical machine, then you have 2 ways to count them, either by counting the physical cores you're using or by counting the virtual cores you're using. So if you choose the physical core method, which you might be required to, or it might be an option, you just count all the physical cores. So you have to get as many licenses as physical cores. On the other hand, if you're running only in the VOSEs, then you have the second option where you can count the number of virtual cores that you're using. And again, using means all the virtual cores in all the VOSEs that are running SQL Server. So if you have that option to do it both ways, you're entitled to choose the lower count of the 2. So basically, this gives you the capability of subcapacity licensing. And of course, there are no CALs. And one more twist on this. We didn't say it above, but if you're running in VOSEs, there is a total limitation that you can only have as many VOSEs as physical cores when you license by the physical cores, so you're limited. But if you have software assurance and you're licensing by physical cores, then you can have more VOSEs running than you even have physical cores. Okay, I think that's probably a little confusing because there's a lot there. So these examples should help a bit. So the first one is where you're running enterprise in the physical machine. And in this example here, we have the same server with the 16 cores. So we simply have to get 16 core licenses. So that's straightforward. Now we're going to have 2 examples about how to do it with the VOSEs. And the first one is if you choose to do it by the physical core option. So we have the same picture as in the previous case. And so what you have here is if you're going to do it by the physical core option, then you do the same computation as the previous ones. There are 16 cores in the physical server. Therefore, you need to get 16 core licenses. What that entitles you to is to run up to 16 VOSEs. So if you do it by the physical, you might run 8 VOSEs, you might run 5, you might run 11. You can do up to 16, but not more than 16 unless you have software assurance. You'll notice that you've got, if you do the 16, that's just 1 VOSE per core. So this is the one case when you get around the 4 core minimum. You don't have to count 4 cores for each VOSE when you're licensing by physical cores. So the other ways you might do it by virtual cores. So we have the same processor with the 16 cores, and in this case we have 2 VMs in that same virtual arrangement we had before where the VM on the left is only using 2 cores and the one on the right is using 8. So you have to count the one using 2 as using 4. That is, the minimum does apply when you're counting by virtuals. So you get a total of 12 cores being used, and therefore you're liable for 12 core licenses. That's still less than 16, so you're saving money, so it's better to do it this virtual way when you come out with a smaller number than 16. Okay, I'll turn it back over to Simin to give you some background thoughts on which licensing type to choose when you are faced with the option.
Great. Thanks, Ken. Yeah, and I've heard there's a couple of questions. We're going to have to, unfortunately, take those at the end because I can't type, but we'll certainly be able to unmute you at the end, and we can go over your questions. So one of the issues that commonly comes up is should you license by server cal or by cores? And obviously this is relevant to standard edition only because the new enterprise edition is core only. So for user cals, obviously you need to be able to count the users, and they shouldn't be too large, too many of them. And a benefit, of course, is that once you've purchased a user cal, that user can access multiple instances of SQL Server in your organization. So that's a potential benefit. Device scales are obviously for situations where there's a limited number of devices and maybe multiple users to that device, like in kiosks and retail environments. Core licenses are for large numbers of users, not easily counted, and those can typically be public-facing web-based applications. And of course, in the Enterprise Edition, that's required. Another question that commonly, typically comes up is should I purchase software assurance for SQL Server? And it's obvious that Microsoft over the last few years is really encouraging people to purchase SA, and there's a lot of features with SA that are not available if you don't have SA. So obviously, as Ken mentioned before, the unlimited number of virtual machines for enterprise core licenses, if you license by physical server. License mobility can be very important, particularly for failover. This removes there's a 90-day limit before you can, within your server farm, to move SQL Server throughout your server farm. But with SA, that limit is removed. It's still there for a cloud, but this is within your server farm. And then obviously the upgrade, as we mentioned, upgrading from 2008 R2 Enterprise Edition processor to 2012 or 14 requires SA. And then for 2014, there was a new failover rights. You get a passive server for each active server. Now that's only with SA. So there are some additional features here that you need to consider. So I will now turn it back to Ken, who will talk about how to achieve compliance.
Okay. Basically, we're going to describe the outlines of a process that you would follow in order to achieve or measure your compliance. And so overall, we mean that it's a process for you to organize all your installed licenses, and somehow you'll be doing an inventory to get all that information. But you need to organize in a certain way. You'll probably go through a certain set of steps to achieve a final organization. And then you'll do the same thing on the entitlement or purchase side, where you get your purchase records together, get them organized in certain ways. And at the end, when you have the final organization on each side, you'll be able to compare them and be able to compare like to like, so to speak, meaning what should be licensed compared to what you've installed of each kind of thing. So let me go into the details. So we have some charts. So the first thing you want to do on the SQL Server side is get all your SQL Server instances together. So here's an example of the initial spreadsheet or table that you would create. Obviously, this is a simple case, but it's going to illustrate the essentials of how we think you should do it. So in this case, you can see we have 4 instances out there that we've inventoried. So we've got an enterprise, a couple of standards, and an Express Edition. And you want to have the version of each. And then, of course, you need to establish, does it require a license or not? And you see with Express, we say no. And then you need to know which servers they're on. And a really important thing is the server a physical or is it a virtual? And then finally, the license type that's going to be applied to that. And I say going to be, in theory, or according to Microsoft, you already chose a license type when you did the installation. But in practice, as a license compliance manager, you might be chasing after that after the fact. So after you've got all the instances together, you need to deal with your physical servers. So the physical servers can be ones that are directly running SQL Server. And I'll go back on this slide. We see Enterprise is running on a physical server. But you also have to worry about the ones that are in the pink color, where they're all virtuals. You have to figure out which physical server those are running on. And it might be a physical server, it might be 2 physical servers. That's critical for you to know. And then, so we'll go on to the chart that shows that. So now we've augmented or modified the previous table. First, we got rid of Express because Express does not require a license. And then the Enterprise and Standard rows are still here. But we added a row, the second row, and that is the physical server that hosts the standards. And in this example, we're assuming that both of those standards are in VOSEs that are on a single physical host. And over on the right, you see we added columns for the critical factors in the license metrics about the server, which is the number of CPUs and cores. And in theory, it might have required hyperthreads, but we simplified that away for this example. And then we did the first step of computing how many licenses are required. So in the case of the Enterprise, it was a straightforward 16 cores, requires 16 licenses. And then in the case of the standards, where there's 2 cores each, we had to count each of those as 4 to meet the minimums. And we total those up, and that's how we got the count of 8, which is in the second row. And you'll notice we put that count in the second row, not on the VMs. And again, that's because the licenses will be applied to that physical server, not to the virtuals. Did I hit the...
Yeah, you went through too many slides, Ken.
Yeah, it's very sensitive to the keyboard. Okay, so the last step is to summarize. What we had in this earlier one is things organized by physical servers, and now you want to organize them by the edition and version and license type and get your totals. So we have this final chart, and we just had 2 kinds of SQL servers, meaning edition, version, and license type that required licensing. And for each of those, we have the total license count. So that's the end of the process on the installation side. So on the entitlement side, you'll do something similar. Obviously, you'll start with your purchase records, and for everybody out there, that might be different as to what it means, your purchase records. But whatever has the records of everything you've purchased, including what the edition was, what the version was, what the license type was, and SA rights, if any. So here's a chart that shows the beginning where basically have each line item you've purchased. So besides the edition, version, and license type of SQL Server and how many you got, it's organized by purchase order. So you see the last 2 lines look the same, but they were purchased on different orders. Not strictly speaking necessary that you divide it up this way, but obviously if you have to go back and check your work or see where something came from, having the purchase order numbers there to go back to is useful. And then you want to summarize that. So we did the same kind of thing as with the discovery. What we want is 1 row for every edition, version, and license type, and the quantity. So that's the end of the purchasing set of charts. And at that point, you just compare the 2. So each of the charts ended up with 1 row for the Enterprise 2014 core and 1 row for the Standard 2014 core. So we're just adding the columns from both charts together. So you see we have the installed license count and the purchase license count. They're right next to each other. And so we can see what our position is, whether we're under or over licensed for what we need. So I'll just point out that our Bell Managed product offers a module called the Bell Managed Data Analytics, and it has much of the automation to do with the process that we've described for discovery, entering your purchase records and organizing them, and reconciling the 2 together. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sumin to introduce the Oracle side of things.
Thanks, Ken. So Oracle we're going to handle in a similar way, and I see that we have some time left, so we don't need to rush through quite as much. So we'll talk about the different editions and options and packs available with Oracle databases, and then how to license those products, and then how to achieve compliance. So similar format. We'll start from the lower level up this time. So the Express Edition is really an entry level, limited to a single CPU and a gig of memory, and actually is pretty applicable to a lot of web-based applications. It has a similar core database to Enterprise Edition. So from a functionality point of view, strictly database-wise, it's a pretty powerful little database. The Personal Edition is interesting. The Personal Edition is really focused on developers because it is only a single user license under the named user plus, and we'll describe that later. And the key feature here is that it comes with all of the database options and features, except for the real application clusters, and we'll describe that in a second. Next is the Standard Edition 1. That's limited to 2 CPU sockets, as Oracle defines it, and there are no options or management packs available for this edition. Standard Edition is limited to 4, and the RAC real application clusters is included. The other options and management packs are not available. And then the big guy is the Enterprise Edition. There is no CPU or memory limitations, and all options and management packs are available as long as you're willing to pay the price. So here's a quick listing of some of the, and I should emphasize some of the options and management packs. There are many more. A lot of these are really what makes Enterprise Edition a major enterprise transaction processing, data mining, fully featured database, and that's why so many organizations have Oracle running their enterprise critical applications. So I will mention this to 2 license types that we have for Oracle. The named user plus, this again requires you to count all users, including whether they're people, whether they're computers, whether they're instruments, can be forklift trucks or thermostats, and then one of the interesting things, though, about the named user plus is once you've licensed that user, they can access multiple instances of the database, and there are, of course, minimums that apply. The second licensing metric is the processor licensing metric, and again, this is in situations where it's difficult to count users, and you have internet-facing applications. There are different metrics to consider here. Under the Standard Edition, it's a socket-based and does not consider any of the cores or hyperthreads in the CPU, simply the CPU itself. And under the Enterprise Edition, it's a core and multiplied by a core factor. There's a very lengthy core factor table that Oracle has. Just so you know, in most servers these days, if you're running Intel Xenon processors, they have a 0.5 core factor. So we'll turn it over to Ken to discuss the licensing rules for these different products. Ken?
Okay, thanks. So we'll follow the same kind of structure as we followed with SQL Server. So some general rules. First is that licenses are assigned only to physical servers. Same thing as with SQL Server. If you're running in virtual machines, that's fine, but that's not the way you assign your licenses. As far as how you count how many licenses you need, the metrics are based only on the characteristics of the physical servers and CPUs, never on the virtual servers and CPUs. And that's different from SQL Server, which either required you to use the virtuals or gave you the option to use the virtuals. And then something that's very different from Microsoft, we didn't mention this, you're probably familiar with Microsoft products in general, that you purchase them and you get a license key, and you supply the license key when you do the installation. Oracle doesn't do that. There are no license keys. And then related to that is when you install the database, you're liable for it, even though you have not installed the license key. On the other hand, the options and packs are often installed when you install the database, but you're not liable for licensing them until you've used them. And it can be tricky to know when you've used them or not. There might be some information you want to get, and you click on something somewhere, and boom, you've used a certain option or pack. So that's just a very tricky area, and you should just be aware that it exists, because the options and packs can be expensive, and you can incur a liability, a big liability, when you don't intend to. Okay, so the rules for the Enterprise Edition. There are two license types, either by named user plus or by processor. In the case of named user, you have to purchase a minimum of 25 per processor. So you'll notice it's not like SQL Server where you purchase a server license and then in addition have to get CALs for the users. Instead, the equivalent of the cost for getting the server is you have to get at least 25 named user licenses per processor for the instance. On the processor side, the way you do it is by the physical cores, and as Sumit mentioned, there's a core factor, so you have to multiply the cores times the core factor. I should add, on Microsoft, they technically have a core factor table, and it's mostly about the 4-core minimum, in fact, along with some special rules for a few AMD processors. So we didn't go into detail on that. And then it's one license per processor. However, the processors are counted. So I have an example here in the case where we have the processor license type. Of course, we're talking about Enterprise Edition, but the server we're talking about is a server that has 2 CPUs on it, and the CPUs are Intel Xeon CPUs. And in this example, they have 4 cores. So we're looking at 2 CPUs times 4 cores, means a total of 8 cores. But because the core factor is 1/2, it's computed as 4 processor licenses. Therefore, if you have 4 processors, you need 4 processor licenses. So you see the cost of $47,500, list at least, multiplied by 4 gives you your total cost. Okay, so on the standard edition, it's the same general thing. There are 2 kinds of licenses, the named user plus and the processor. In this case, the minimum is much smaller, so you have to purchase 5 named users when you get the server. On the processor side, you're licensing, or you're counting by CPUs. So in the Enterprise, you're counting by cores with a core factor. But with the standard, it's CPUs, so the cores don't matter. And you need to get 1 license for each of the CPUs. And there's also a capacity limitation. Again, that's a usage thing, not a computing how many licenses you need kind of thing. So here's an example. We use exactly the same server as before. It's got 2 Intel Xeon CPUs, which each have 4 cores. So in this case, the cores don't matter. So it's just the fact that there are 2 CPUs means you need 2 licenses. So your cost is 2 licenses times the cost per license. And you see the numbers spelled out here. Okay, so they have something called the Standard Edition 1, which is an even lower cost edition than the standard. As far as the licensing types of the named user plus in the processor, it's the same as for the standard. Either 5 named users or license all the CPUs, again, ignoring the cores. The difference is in the maximum capacity of the computer that you install it on. The computer must be less powerful than the maximum for the standard. So we have an example here. Same server as before. It's our server with the 2 Intel Xeon CPUs with 4 cores. So since everything is being done by CPUs, it's got 2 CPUs, so you need 2 processor licenses. And you multiply that out to get your costs and the follow-on costs. Okay, and finally the last 2 editions. The personal one is very straightforward. You cannot use it with a processor license. You simply have to get 1 named user, and that allows you to run 1 database instance. So it's really personal. It's 1 user can run 1 database on 1 computer, and that's it. And then the Express Edition is the free edition, so licensing rules in a sense don't exist. You can just use it. And there's a usage limitation. limiting the size of the computer you can put it on. Okay, so we were talking just about the database, and we covered the kind of things that we did with SQL Server. That went a little quicker than SQL Server because you don't consider the characteristics of virtual machines, so overall the rules are simpler. On the other hand, when you're talking about the Enterprise Edition, you have options and management packs. And you probably heard Suman mention there are options and management packs in some of the other versions, but whatever there is what it is. With the Enterprise Edition, you have the choice of getting them or not getting them. And that makes things more complex and can add a lot of cost. So here's just a summary of which options and management packs are included or not with each edition. So with the Enterprise Edition, it's all on the table. You purchase each thing you want, you pay for it. With the other ones, what's included is included, and what's not is not, and you can't add anything else. So these options and packs are important because they can cost as much or more than the database itself, which can be expensive. So here's an example where we have a rack cluster. The rack is the real applications cluster. That's the capability to have multiple computers running a database. And in this case, we have 2 nodes, meaning there are 2 computers that are going to be running the database. And each is the kind of server we talked about before that has the 2 CPUs and 4 cores per CPU. So as far as the number of processor licenses in this case, we have the 2 times the 2 times the 4. It gives you a total of 16 processors in this case because it's 8 per server. And then the core factor is 1/2. So we get a total of 8 processor licenses, 4 processor licenses on each node. So you see with the $23,000 list price for each of those times 8, you come up with a fairly big number, and then all the add-on costs. And that's just one of the options that you might get. And some of the options are less expensive than that, and some are more expensive. So it's very important that you know about the options. I didn't want to go ahead there. And I want to reiterate, just because you install an option, that doesn't mean you're liable for a license. It's when you use it. So you need to determine that you're using it. Of course, if you're not using it and you get a license, you're covered, but you're overpaying. Okay, I'm going to go through this very rapidly. We don't have the same charts we had with SQL Server. The process for measuring your Oracle compliance is pretty much identical to the one you'd follow with SQL Server. The only real difference being in the details of how you compute how many licenses are required, given the different set of rules. So you want to get your discovery organized and do it in the same way as before by the addition, the version, the license type, and the failover. And notice we added the word product. If you're watching closely, it's organized by product in addition. And that's because we're not just talking about the database. We're also talking potentially about the options and packs. And then the same thing on the license side. So just a quick review that you want to first put all your instances together and know which servers they're running on and what kind of servers there are. And then the second step is to identify all the involved physical servers, which are the ones that are either running Oracle directly or they're hosting virtual machines that are running it even though the physical server is not itself running Oracle. And then collect the characteristics of the processors and cores, assuming that you're doing the per processor licensing type. If you're doing the named user license type, then that data won't matter. Whoop. Yeah, I guess I covered that. And then on the purchase side, it's the same thing. Get all your purchase records together, organized by the same characteristics of the product, the edition, the version, the license type. And then finally, you compare the 2 sides to each other, what you purchased and what you installed. And as with the SQL Server, our data analytics module has a set of reports that automate the discovery and the computation of the licenses you're required. and it'll reconcile that with your purchase records. And I'll leave it to Suman to do a wrap-up.
Thanks, Ken. Yeah, so we did list a number of these licensing rules for both SQL Server, Oracle, and Windows Server on our website. So you can go to this URL and take a look. And I would like to open it up for questions. Great. Well, we want to thank everyone. If you would like a copy of the presentation, I know we had to go through it fairly quickly. So if you would like a copy, please send us an email to either Ken or myself, or even to info@belarc.com. And hopefully in a few days' time, we will also have the webinar streaming on our website. So thank you all, and appreciate your attendance.